Good morning. Someday, oh, dream maker, you heartbreaker, wherever you're going, I'm going your way. Two drifters off to see the world. There's such a lot of world to see. We're after the same rainbows and waiting round the bend, my huckleberry friend, Moon River and me.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Maloney. I'm the Vice Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs, and welcome to this, the 8th Youth and Leaders Summit hosted here at Sciences Po. That was a very nice opening by Guillermo Loyola Palez, who's an MSc environmental policy student here at PSIA. And you'll find over the course of the day there'll be a few more interventions by her, musical interludes, part of the theme of this year's summit. Second student artist as well, but I'll let our dean introduce her as well as part of the introduction. So we're going to start in just 1 minute. We're just going to get the final things off the stage, and then I'm going to invite to the stage right now, in fact, the director of Sciences Po, Matthias Vichera, and the dean of PSIA, Arantxa Gonzalez. Please.
After such a fantastic moment, this is very difficult for me. This is really difficult. Don't worry, it won't be long. Dear Arantxa Gonzalez, Dean of PSIA, dear Mark Maloney, Vice Dean of PSIA, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, my dear friends, welcome to Sciences Po. First of all, I would like to thank you for accepting our invitation to the 8th Annual Youth and Leader Summit, a unique international conference that gives students a central role in its organization and in the debate. And I would like to congratulate and to thank especially the 30 students from PSIA who helped to organize and deliver this event. This summit is really special for two main reasons. The first one, for the standing and diversity of the leaders, of the speakers. And the second reason has to do with the fact that there is a true dialogue between leaders and the students. And in a way, this summit is a place where youth can engage and challenge the leaders. Please, dear students, we want you to raise your voice today. Don't be impolite, but you need to be challenging. You need to be challenging because our leaders need to be challenged by you. I'm also convinced that these exchanges have a great deal to offer to the leaders we invite. These leaders will meet new visions of society, new ways of thinking, and new ambitions. And I would like also to congratulate and to thank the New York Times for the tremendous partnership that we have with them. This edition of the Youth and Leader Summit is really special. We don't have one topic. The previous editions, we had one topic. This year, we have a series of burning issues that present existential risks to the global order, existential risk to the global order. It is clear for us that there are many issues that are interconnected. You know that: climate change, digital transition, populism, growing economic inequality. Don't worry, my friends. I won't try to address all these issues myself in a few minutes. But as you know, the world is at crossroads, and Sciences Po has a specific role to play. We do believe that we are not a university like any other. We have a specific role in that situation. Due to the fact that we were founded 150 years ago in a specific condition, you know that, after the war. And we have also a specific responsibility because we train free-thinking leaders, new leaders, capable of making informed decisions. We deeply believe at Sciences Po that teaching and research can change the world. This is maybe a little bit immodest, but we do believe that. And this is precisely what you are going to do today. You will try to understand the world, you will think out of the box, and you will identify new tools and new solutions. Before concluding this speech, I wanted just to tell you that we do have a specific issue that we share with Pia, with Arantxa, with Marc, with all the communities of Sciences Po. It has to do with academic freedom. Academic freedom. You know, this is not just a corporate topic. This is not just a corporate issue for researchers, for universities. This is one of the foundations of democracy. This is a necessary condition of democracy. And in this current period of time, we do have one of our members, one of the members of our communities, Fariba Adelha, who has been jailed for 3 years only because of her research. And we do believe that academic freedom is really, really, really something to protect, really something to promote. And this is the reason why, you know, that even in the European Union, there are some issues about academic freedom. For instance, the Central European University was displaced from Budapest to Vienna. And this is the reason why, at Sciences Po, with all the communities, we want to nominate them, CEU, Fariba, this year to the Peace Nobel Prize. We do believe that this is our role to promote, to protect academic freedom, thanks to this proposal. I hope that you will join us in this mobilization for them. Again, my friends, all my gratitude to the speakers, to the fantastic speakers for taking part in this summit, for sharing their thinking with us, and most importantly, for their willingness to be challenged by our students. A big applause to the PSIA team, please. For the students involved in this organization. Now, let me hand over to the fantastic Dean of PSIA, Arantxa González. Thank you, my friends.
Many thanks, Matthias. Thank you very much for the framing that you've done for this conference. Many thanks also to Guillermina for the music, and to Ana Verena, the artist that is going to be illustrating the debates today, because art is also part of our DNA. We can express it with music, we can express it with designs, with cartoons. It's a sobering start of the year. And it's sobering because we're going to start with the risks that threaten all of us. Risks to our common prosperity, risks to our freedom and rights, risks to life in our ocean, risks to our planet, and the existential risk of a nuclear threat. And it's sobering because these are human-made risks. We have created those risks. And therefore, we have the power to manage or to harness them. It's in our hands. There is no fatalism about these risks. And this is why today's discussion is about how can we manage those risks. It's not about being sad about the risks, which we are, but it's what we can do to harness them. And this is why leadership matters. And this is why this edition is about youth and leaders. This is obviously your edition. You've chosen the topics. You are on the driving seat, which is why, again, this is about youth and leaders. Resolving the dilemmas around these risks is going to necessitate a few ingredients. So let me throw a few ingredients so that we can use them in the conversations during the day. First, managing those risks requires rigorous research, rigorous analytics, rigorous thinking. No magical thinking will address those risks. Second, it requires dialogue, it requires discussion, it requires to express the disagreements, but also to find common points of convergence, agreements. Disagreeing has not been an enemy. It's just simply expressing a different position. So let's try to express different positions if we have them. The ingredient I want to throw for the conversation is empathy. Empathy, which means basically putting ourselves in the shoes of the other. Thus, for example, would be essential in the discussion we will have on the energy transition, which needs to be fair. And for that, we need a bit of empathy. Finally, I would suggest we need a bit of respect if we are to create the trust that is necessary to manage those risks. These are some of the ingredients that I think we need to consider when addressing those challenges. Now, this is about youth and leaders, but it's therefore an intergenerational dialogue. Because there is no fatalism, there is a bit of responsibility on the younger generation also to lead, to find fair, equitable solutions, effective means to address today's challenges. And this is why we will end today with Chai Surui. This is, by the way, one of the choices for speaking at this Youth and Leaders Summit. She's a 25-year-old Brazilian from an indigenous group, the Paiter Surui in the Amazon, who's decided to be an activist, to fight, to protect the Amazon, and through that, fight against climate change. She's convinced that you, can influence today, since at the end of the day, the future is yours. So, engage, discuss, debate with respect, but also without being afraid of expressing disagreement or dissent. I hope you learn a lot from our guests. I am sure the guests will learn a lot from all of you. Let me end with a word of gratitude to our media partner, the New York Times. We are extremely proud to work with you every year to deliver this event. Stephen, Liz, thank you very much for being with us today. You're going to have fun, you know that, because you've been here before. This year even more. And with this, let the forum begin, and let's start the first conversation. Let me call on stage José Manuel Salazar. He is the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. She's come all the way from Chile to be with us this morning. Let me call also Katarina Körner from the International Economic Policy Master, Julie Byrne, International Economic Policy Master, who are going to be part of this conversation, and last but not least, Liz Alderman, who is a great journalist from the New York Times, specialized in economic and trade, who's going to moderate this conversation. Without further ado, give them a big applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good morning and welcome to this very first panel. As a student of international economic policy, I'm delighted to introduce this topic to you. A rise in geopolitical tensions is provoking strategic competitions between countries and entire regions. As a result, and despite decades of openness that have fostered economic interdependence, the risk of economic fragmentation is rising. Since joining PSIA last year, I have studied the complex interrelations of trade, inequality, war, and the potential limits of globalization. On the other hand, several theories tell us trade and openness reduce inequalities. However, we cannot combine this with the empirical data we see today, which clearly shows a growth in inequality in many of the trade-open countries. So with some of these promises of globalization yet to be fulfilled, how do we go on from here? And at the same time, trade has a complex interrelationship with war and peace. While logically we would believe to create economic interdependencies and therefore that would lead to more peace, a more integrated world also means less dependency on your country neighbors. And particularly, these country neighbors tend to go to war with each other. So then, let's define economic fragmentation to understand what we are talking about on this panel here. The COVID-19 pandemic, and more recently, Russia's invasion and war against Ukraine, have shown us the limits of such global supply chains and maybe even globalization itself. Therefore, what we mean with economic fragmentation here refers to the recent wave of protectionism and the result of breaking down in supply chains. At the same time, we see institutional fragmentation, in which long relied upon international and trade organizations witness to be increasingly unable and to act and less united in it. Therefore, this panel will discuss the risks of fragmentation, how these risks and fragmentation itself can maybe even be avoided or reduced, and instead how important benefits of trade can be promoted in the future. For this, I am pleased to introduce our panelist, Katharina Körner, who is a fellow graduate student of international economic policy, will bring her perspective with her highly relevant background in financial regulation and emerging markets. Her previous studies focused on development economic growth, inequality, and her view makes her highly suitable and enriching for this panel. To our great pleasure, and already mentioned, we are joined as well by Mr. José Manuel Salazar, the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America. Mr. Salazar has previously served as Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean of the International Labour Organization, as well as Minister of Foreign Trade of Costa Rica. He has further authored several books and academic articles on development and trade. Mr. Salazar, we are pleased to have you with us today. And lastly, I'm particularly delighted to introduce our moderator, Liz Alderman. She's the Chief European Business Correspondent for the New York Times. And her focus is on economics, policy developments, and social issues. Ms. Alderman is a recipient of the Times Nathaniel Nash Award for Excellence in Business and Economic Journalism. She and her team were honored by the Society of American Business Editors and Writers in 2013. We are honored to have you with us here today as our moderator, and I'm looking forward to the panel and the discussion following. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Can you all hear me? Can you hear okay? Thank you for that, Julie. You seriously, set the stage of basically the biggest challenges that we're going to be talking about this morning. And I think it's timely that we're opening with this panel because what we're going to be talking about does constitute one of the sort of major tectonic shifts that we're seeing in the world today, and that is this issue of economic fragmentation. And as Julie mentioned, I mean, just to set the background here, Mr. Salazar, since the last year when you all met here at this summit, we've obviously seen, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is now going on its second year. That has had major ramifications beyond the theater of war in terms of economic policy, political implications, and of course, social implications for countries around the world. That came on the heels of us all coming out of almost 2 years worth of COVID-19 lockdowns, which in and of itself raised questions about supply chains as well as raised questions about the wisdom of globalization itself. If we throw on top of that US-China trade tensions, something called Brexit, as well as, relative, a lot of changes that we're seeing happening in Latin America, these tectonic shifts are, require major policy solutions. So, Mr. Sal, let me just open up by asking you what, to your mind, are the implications of this fragmentation, and how should the people in this room be thinking about it going forward?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Liz. Good morning to everyone. And first of all, my deep thanks and appreciation to Dean Bicherat and to Arantxa Gonzalez. Really, it's an honor to be and a pleasure to be here. As I see you from here, and I just took a picture of all of you, I remember some 40 years ago when I was sitting, on that side, listening to people and all, curious about the world, and also with aspirations and desires to, in a way to change the world, or at least to make a difference, in the corner that we can do. So I'm so excited now to be able to be here. I'm honored. I think it's fantastic and very inspiring what we heard from both deans, so to speak, in terms of the leadership. And today, frankly, I think as a general reflection, as we have this world full of challenges, and as it is totally correct. I remember when I was young and saying, many older people saying, you are the future, you're the future. And, you listen to that and you let it pass. You didn't take it completely, seriously. But if you think about it, you are the future. And absolutely, sometime in future years, all of you, or some of you, many of you, are going to be sitting in panels, enlightening the new generations about, or making an effort at least to enlighten about all sorts of subjects and challenges. So thank you very much for that, and for me it's very exciting and an honor to be here. Now, this topic, and by the way, well, congratulations to all of you who chose the subjects, and starting with this one. It is really, a complicated story, because we seem to be, I think the first thing to recognize is that the kind of globalization we were used to and we were talking about, and many institutions and leaders and so on were trying to build 30 years ago, as recently as 30 or 20 years ago, has changed very radically. The question is, to what extent and in what ways and so on, and we can get into the details. But we used to be, and, I'm old enough, I guess, to remember, before the WTO, the GATT, the multilateral system, and all the system that was built after the Second World War, that for 30 years or 40 years gave a tremendous boost to the world economy. It was a world of relative stability. Of course, there was the Cold War, but in terms of the trade system, there was a lot of agreement to build a system around a set of rules which were predictable, that everybody would agree. And if there were violations, then there was a dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO to go about it. Even China acceded to the WTO, So that was the idea. Then things started to change. I think you can put several phases in this. A lot of it came, I would say, you know, putting precise dates and so on is a little bit arbitrary, but I think the financial crisis made a big difference. And you started to see, you know, some cracks in the system. There was a big shock to the world economy. And also, it affected the environment of ideas, you know, the idea that markets will drive, that there were there could be self-regulation of markets, and that was the best of all worlds. After the financial crisis, when governments rescued the financial system with a heavy-handed kind of intervention, which was unthinkable before, the paradigm of markets know best, and markets can regulate in a wise way and so on, and governments only distort, and governments are, you know, not effective and so on. That kind of, you know, changed completely the intellectual climate. And after that, it's been a very different world. If you look at the figures, in fact, it is very clear, if you measure by the amount of trading goods as opposed to trading services, it is true that from 2000 to 2010, the growth of trade and the indicator of trade to GDP is much higher in the last decade. So from that point of view, if you use that indicator, clearly there has been some deglobalization, some reduction in the amount of trade versus GDP of countries. Now, if you look at the same indicators for services, there's a different story. Then you have almost, maybe explosion is a bit of a strong word, but you have a very dynamic trade in services in the last 10 years, and we know why. Digital revolution, the giants, and Amazon, and Tencent in China, and I mean, all this revolution. And ironically, or anyway, it is the pandemic that brought so many bad things. One of the few good things, or relative, or maybe you don't have to qualify whether it's good or bad, it's just a reality, is that the pandemic increased tremendously, you know, the digital revolution and, you know, electronic commerce and trading services and so on. So there you have a bit of a, you know, two sides to the coin of globalization. Then there are many other things one can talk about. I mean, I don't want to make a long, you know, I want to make a lecture out of I know you want conversation, but I would say that the bottom line, and I'll be happy to go deeper into this, is that yes, I think there has been some deglobalization and fragmentation, but not everything is that. You can also point out to some trends towards integration. And perhaps let me say something provocative about this. I would say that all these friendshoring and nearshoring trends is probably more a restructuring than fragmentation. You know, and the risk, if we go too far in that direction, of course there is regionalism, and then you have you know, to use a metaphor, the factory around the United States, the factories around the big markets. So many multinational companies of the United States coming to the US or Mexico or Central American, Latin American countries. You will have Asian countries, you have European, the three big factories of the world. You know, if you could kind of picture this in some kind of modern technology, you know, network, you will see the nodes getting stronger at the regional level than they used to be before, because of the geopolitical, you know, the insecurity about supplying and depending on China, production from China and so on. But still, that is trade. You know, if you measure that by the trade to GDP ratio, that's still going to be trade. What will not be trade is value chains that come back to US territory or to European territory. You know, if there's a factory in China, extreme example, microchips, and all the microchip production in the future, because of the new legislation and so comes to the United States, then that is a strong version of fragmentation. If those factories come to Mexico or Costa Rica or Brazil or Argentina, that will still be trade, because all those chips are not going to be consumed in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina.
Right, so we're seeing,
so
yeah, exactly. Let me ask Katerina to jump in here, if I may, because I think, you know, you made an important point, which is basically, essentially what we are seeing is, you're saying it's not necessarily fragmentation, Mr. Salazar, but I mean, what we're seeing is right now, This, world of globalization as we knew it does seem to be reversing. We've got, because of US trade policies, for example, companies are moving production away from China and to places like Mexico. Here in Europe, here in France, the French government has talked about, let's see if we can move the production of things like, pharmaceuticals, back to France and whatnot. I mean, Katerina, sort of, what do you see as the social, who are studying sort of social implications, what do you see as, I guess, the social and economic implications of this tectonic movement that Mr. Salazar is referring to?
Thank you very much for the introduction. Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. So thank you very much for the opening speech. I think you really got to the point when you said that the bottom line is that we see some deglobalization and that we really see the patterns of trade that we've witnessed for the last, let's say, 50 to 70 years really fundamentally changing. And I think if you ask yourself the question, I see this phenomenon, I think you really definitely directly get into the socioeconomic part of it and also the political part, because of course we have seen that trade has enabled growth, trade has enabled economic competitiveness. But for example, especially if we look at China, we also see, did not only see the GDP rising, we saw their income per capita rising, we saw their share in global GDP tremendously rising, and also their share of merchandise goods. And all of these factors, what they lead to is that China is not only an economic power, but also this political power. And I think this has now really important implications, because while we always focused on the operation of global supply chains, which has enabled globalization in the way that we've seen it and also that we benefited from it, for some time, we really neglected these, let's say, political and socioeconomic consequences, and that a rising economic power also means rise of political power, and that large emerging economies will also start demanding their stake in, for example, the international institutions. And this is something we now see, or especially that Europe and the US has been faced within the last years, and now kind of instead of, tackling it, and instead of talking with each other, what we saw more and more recently is that we start talking about each other and even start excluding each other. And I think this is really the big problem here, because at the end, as also the Dean mentioned, the whole globalization, it's man-made. It's what we were striving for and what we thought was best for our economic development, and now really turning, basically 80 degrees around and excluding each other. I think this is really just the bottom line of what is so problematic on the social and political side.
Well, Mr. Salazar, what is your response to that?
Yeah, no, thank you, Katerina. That's very insightful, because, I mean, the thing is that, as was said at the beginning, there is an economic dimension for this, there is an institutional dimension, and there's a geopolitical, and of course, these interact in complex ways. So this is why this topic is fascinating, and also, So I was referring more to the economic, kind of fragmentation. And on that, and I'll come back to the geopolitics, but look, already in the 90s, I don't know, all of you were babies, I guess, in the, at that time, or even had not been born, depending on the year. But in the 90s, I remember, there was the backlash. It was called the backlash against globalization. There was a lot of literature. There was a lot of anger already, particularly in developed countries, because but what was happening was import competition. China had become the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, and was, there was a tsunami of exports from China, all sorts of things. And then there were all these arguments that then developed countries were losing jobs. And not only that, but that one of the reasons why China was becoming this powerhouse, because US and European multinationals went to China to produce. So these were actually, many of these goods were produced by these multinationals, and that was to the deterioration and the income inequality and so on. There was a big debate whether this was trade or this was what economists call skills-biased technological change, which is a complicated word just to say, look, when you have this technological revolution, then you have a demand for skills, high skills and so on, and then all the unskilled workers, are losers, and the high skilled workers. So there were the two effects. Many, in economics think that that is actually the main, and not just in the 90s, still today, that it is the technological revolution, the greatest threat to jobs and to inequality, because, the skilled workers get more higher wages and so on, while the unskilled, because of automation, robotics and so on, get put aside. And that's why social policies become so important, not just social, but education, skilling, reskilling throughout life and so on. So that's one dimension of the globalization. And this, but the thing is, what I'm saying, I guess, again, it's a provocative idea. That was China. The characteristic of that stage of globalization is the concentration of manufacturing production was tremendous in China. So if now we're entering into a world in which the production of manufacturers is not going to be so concentrated in China, but it's going to be dispersed in Brazil, and this opens opportunities for many. If you put in the shoes of many developing countries, the Africans, there was a lot of literature in economics saying, oh my goodness, Africans are too bad, they didn't industrialize. China became this powerhouse. I mean, what is Africans' bet in terms of developing and creating jobs? Well, in this new world, one could think that there are a lot of opportunities for industrialization in Africa because of the distribution by multinationals and government, having outsourcing of value chains a bit more dispersed. I know this is provocative, but I mean, think about it, really. And again, this is more restructuring than deglobalization per se. I'm not saying that there isn't deglobalization, but let me finish with one figure. Yeah. Very important here. If you remember the period of very strong recent period in the 20th century of deglobalization in the world was the period between the First and Second World Wars and the Depression. The trade to GDP ratio fell from 29% in 2013 to 10% in 1945, only 10%. Now, it reached 61% in 2008. So the 90s, this was the hyper-globalization period. It went all the way, imagine, from 10% at the end of the war to 60%. Now, all this deglobalization concern that we see, at the moment in 2020, the rate was 52%. And it has had an average of just 44% in the 90s. So actually, even with the 10 points of, backsliding, if you like, we are 10 points on that indicator more globalized than we were in the 90s, despite everything that's happened.
Let me ask you this. I mean, the implications of what you're saying. One of the questions that we often hear is, isn't there a limit to all of this growth that we're talking about? Katerina, what are your thoughts on that? Because when we talk about these issues that you're bringing up, in the last 10 to 20 years, the issue of overgrowth, overproduction, overcapacity, but also the impact that we are making to the environment and the way that governments as well as corporations need to deal with that has really moved onto the front burner. Katerina, can you talk about that briefly?
Yeah. Sure. Thank you very much for bringing this point up because, again, it does have a very strong socioeconomic character, as we touched upon before. So basically, when we started establishing Bretton Woods institution after the Second World War, we commonly agreed on a system, as you said, built on growth and also built on US dominance and capitalism. And we fundamentally agreed on a shared system of values and norms, and steady growth was always a part of it. So what this created is really a strong fragmentation, and here we have this other layer of fragment between the North and the South. So I'm referring to the global North and global South here, where now, especially with the climate crisis, we see how this has such drastic and different consequences on these different countries. And for example, then, of course, at recent international summits, such as the COP27, we see developing countries demanding financial aid and financial recuperation, so blaming developed countries for having caused the existential crisis of the climate and of our planet that we are faced with. And I believe that this really underlines and emphasizes the downsides of what we have called the hyperglobalization or the glorious globalization that Mr. Salazar, you also mentioned. So I think fundamental to this is really that what we have perceived as so glorious for a couple of decades, now we really see that the downsides of the globalization and also of the operation of our global value chains, which do have growth as one of their main targets and purpose, this is really harmful because it has only benefited, or it has predominantly benefited one side of the globe way more than other regions. And therefore, I believe, or I'm strongly convinced that it's really important that we also engage in breaking up these strong north-south patterns and instead really strengthen, for example, also south-south trade, which has been something that was not really incorporated in how we operated supply chains for the last decades.
Absolutely, and I think, that brings up a major issue, which is, how do policymakers, how do people like yourselves as, future leaders, basically, how do we address that? Because we can have ideas about how the world should look, even as these tectonic shifts are taking place. But actually sort of hammering out, how to achieve that vision, knowing that there will be winners and losers, is a major challenge. So Mr. Salazar, maybe you could offer a brief point about that before I open it up to you all from the audience to get ready to ask your questions. Prepare them, because you're going to have the next 20 minutes to throw questions up here to these folks. Mr. Salazar?
Yeah. No, let me say that there's no doubt, and I want to say it very explicitly, that not only that globalization has changed, but that the multilateral system is on tremendous risk. And there are scenarios in which the world can go in very negative directions. I'm an economist, but I'm going to trespass a little bit and talk about the geopolitics, because that's what's happened after, and there's going to be one of the participants today on a session on the nuclear threat and so on. The geopolitics has changed tremendously. I mean, there was the moment of the end of history in the 90s, Fukuyama, remember, when the Cold War finished and so on, which was, of course, totally false. And now we seem to be, again, in a moment, already the rise of China was creating very clear rivalries. And we haven't talked explicitly. This is not just about value chains and trade. This is about technology. The real kind of confrontation, potentially, in all sorts of ways, is the fact that China has emerged not just as a manufacturing powerhouse, but as a technological powerhouse. And the companies in China, and the artificial intelligence, and the semiconductors, and all sorts of new technologies. Artificial intelligence, China is clearly ahead of Europe and the United States. I mean, you can go and check that one, and they have the oil for this revolution is the big data, and nobody has, as a country, more big data than China, and richer data. Because of a number of characteristics on each Chinese person. There is that, and then the geopolitics after the war, of course, is the insecurity. Before everybody was very happy, it doesn't matter if semiconductors or 80% or 90% of microchips are produced in China because, trade. It doesn't matter that food is produced there and so on. Now the word security is everywhere, and this is geopolitics. We're talking about energy security. We're talking about food security. We're talking about, security was for the military security. Now security is for all the supplies and logical production. So think about these examples. Europe depending from Russian oil and gas. You've seen this debate in the newspapers. So this is the new, and this is a geopolitical source of fragmentation. If you think that your main supplier of oil and gas is unreliable, you don't want to depend on this country or group of countries. The US depending from Chinese semiconductors, or the world depending from food from Ukraine and Russia. So this is different. See, this is a different logic. This is geopolitics, and I think it's something that should be analyzed. And again, all this needs cooperation. These things could get ugly and nasty, even going to war, if there isn't a clarity that you have to negotiate these different subjects, that everybody will be worse off if we try to all be self-sufficient or go to autarky. That's a disaster scenario.
That absolutely would be. Katerina, do you have a very quick response? And then if you could please raise your hand so we can bring the microphone to you for questions that you might have.
Yes, I just really quickly wanted to address, because also the leading question of our panel was how to avoid economic fragmentation, which for me really also meant to engage with the solutions, with potential solutions that we have and that we see. And therefore, thank you, Mr. Salazar, to again also emphasizing the role and also their growing strength in the technology and in many different areas, because I really believe that especially the US and Europe, they need to take and sit with China at the table and really try to find a role of them in our institutional framework, which will also mean to reform this framework, because especially the WTOs, there is the demand for reforming these institutions for years or maybe even decades, but it has not yet happened. And really to find a role of China in this institutional framework, in my perspective, it's going to be one of the most essential steps in order to avoid or worsen economic fragmentation. And this also with then fighting the consequences of the socioeconomic divide that we've seen. And so initiatives such as fighting or striving to achieve a universal social protection, I think initiatives like this is really, really important, because otherwise what we'll do is just increasing the inequalities and also increasing insecurities, feeling of insecurities. And I think once people feel this economic and social insecurity, they just try to protect themselves and they will strive towards something which is definitely not cooperation.
Absolutely, and we've already seen that unfold in a number of countries, including in the United States. Could I invite anybody who has a question to step up to the microphone? We've got one there. One on each side. I know I told you to raise your hands, but and it would be really wonderful if because we have maybe about 20 minutes or so, a little bit less than 20 minutes. If you could sort of ask your question directly and try not to go too much into a speech, although we do want to hear what you have to say. Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay.
Introduce yourself as well, if you could.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ricarda. I'm a first-year's master's student in international governance and diplomacy, and thank you very much for the panel. It was very interesting to see the different aspects of economic fragmentation. I wanted to dive a bit deeper into the role of Africa, since we often talk about Europe, the US, and China. You briefly mentioned, Mr. Salazar, the role of Africa within skilled and unskilled labors. Whilst I think personally I don't really agree with this term of skilled and unskilled labors, I think that's also to put into maybe more parentheses. I wanted to know what your thoughts are on an inclusion of Africa, whilst not kind of having this post-colonial ideal of knowing what's best for the continent, and at the same time also avoiding a sustainability degrade, as we've seen with the rise of China. I think we have a lot of different tensions there. Could you please elaborate on your thoughts on that?
It's a really good and thoughtful question for you.
Oh, yes. Right, yeah. Well, yeah, I feel more comfortable talking about Latin America, but I can give you some. Yeah, well, you know, we know the colonial history of Africa and so on, and actually that was something that fragmented Africa tremendously, you know. French colonies, UK colonies, Portuguese colonies, Belgium colonies, you know, and European powers divided up Africa, you know, basically over negotiations over, you know, a map and a desk. So, I mean, what's that for fragmentation? Now, the challenge, the Africans now are taking, well, now, since decades ago, you know, not only with independence, it's very difficult because of all sorts of reasons, you know, lack of education and the poverty and the struggle for power, and that in a way, to some extent, continues. But I think Africa has made tremendous strides in strengthening, you know, democratic systems, having developmental states that are actually institutions working on the different areas. They have the African Union, they have integration. This is a huge continent. I think a couple of years ago they went over 1 billion in population. So economic integration and the markets in Africa, assuming you can integrate more physically and so on, you know, it's a tremendous source. So the Africans, of course, are looking for development. Something that fragments societies and politics a lot is all the political economy of extractivities, and minerals and oil and so on, and that's because of the relationship with the West. I mean, I don't want to talk about a new kind of colonialism or anything like that, because this is putting it into two, but it's a reality that you have to deal with, you know, how to use the oil and mineral wealth, same problem as in Latin America, to produce development and not to have super unequal, you know, income distribution. So a lot of diversity in Africa. I think Africa has gone a long way. By the way, now these are grounds where, you know, what is the US doing? What is Europe doing? What is China doing? Chinese, very pragmatic. You know, first they have investments, they give presence, they build stadiums, they build roads. They do business with Africa. They have, I think every 2 years, even annual every 2 years, a big summit, China-African leaders. There's also a European, African, you know. So anyway, this is to say the Africans, many of them have good leadership, have a vision, but they are still, you know, of course, a lot of work to do to solve inequalities and so on and so forth. But final thought, this fragmentation, and that's why on that, I'm not so concerned about, as you saw in my comments, about the nearshoring. You know, I think that could actually open opportunities for African and Latin American countries, and it's still trade. I mean, just picture a world, instead of having this huge concentration in China and Africa of production, you're going to have it more spread out. Is that good? Is that bad? Well, they're losers, they're winners, but I mean, you still have a lot of trade. It's just a different kind of globalization. Yeah. For me, the globalization was much more dangerous. It's the geopolitical and the technological, you know, kind of rivalry and the war, you know, that shows that, you know, it was unthinkable. That after what happened in the world in the 20th century, many of us will think, is it going to happen again? I mean, a war like we're having now in Ukraine is something to see. No, I mean, before this is, I mean, you will just say, no, this is never going to happen. Well, it's happening, and it hasn't finished. And
yeah, it's
yeah, that's very concerning.
Far from over. Thank you for that question. Let's hear from our next speaker.
Good morning, first of all. Thank you very much for the discussion. It was very insightful in any case. You touched upon several different topics. For example, when you were talking about if there is a limit to growth, you already alluded to this aspect that maybe this steady growth that we have been focusing on up to now may have been something that has predominantly benefited developed countries. And in another context, you also mentioned that there might be some sort of reorganization of the current order. If we now take into account the question of human rights, especially in the context of China, how do you imagine this new paradigm to be that we should follow if we are conceiving, first of all those human rights abuses on the one side, and secondly also the current problems that we have with our global order right now?
Yeah, the issue of human rights, maybe I could ask the both of you to, or Katerina, if that's all right with you, unless you'd like to answer that one, Mr. Salazar.
No, go ahead.
Yeah,
I would like to make a comment, but
yes.
Yes.
So I think it's a very important issue that you bring up here, because again, it underlines the social character of this economic and trade that we've spoken about. And when talking about the globalization, the kind of globalization that we've created in the first place, I think it's really important to realize that it did not only or predominantly benefited specific countries, but also only specific classes of a society. So it is still the reality that, especially that, for example, also in developed countries, women get paid significantly less than men, even though they do the same jobs. And even more in developing countries, women are still exposed to higher security and health risks when performing their jobs. So I think when talking about human rights, it's really important that we engage in activities where we are able to address the whole of society, and that we really engage in taking everyone. And for me, this really has to do with, for example, striving towards increasing the formal sector of the economy, and really trying to minimize the informal economy, because we need social protection for everyone, for example. And this also comes with strengthening small and medium-sized businesses, which are sometimes, or in some countries, really led more by women. So really by taking these grassroots initiatives and not only focusing on the economic impact of multinationals, for example, I think this is the way how we can take everyone and strive towards growth or economic prosperity altogether.
That's a really good point. Mr. Salazar, a very, very brief point from you before we move on to the next question.
A brief point is that I think it's very linking this question of human rights, which is broad, with the trade discussion we were having on globalization. One good trend in recent years is that the normative values, it's a matter of values, you know, Western values, if you want to call them, democracy and human rights and United Nations, all of that. Increasingly, they are into trade agreements. You know, you have now labor chapters, social chapters. In the financial sector, the World Bank, IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, regional banks are having social and environmental frameworks that make conditions on the loans, on the ways that the multinational companies or treats the indigenous communities, treats the communities where the projects are going to be. So this issue of human rights is getting into economic issues, from financial issues to trade. That's a good development. Now, what happens when there are partners, trade partners or partners in, you know, in financial that say, no, I don't want that, you know, remove the human rights clause, remove the labor clause, the environmental clause. And that's the problem with China, but not only with China. I won't mention names, but in Latin America, you have human rights problems, and in other areas as well. So, of course, it's not a systemic risk, it's not the rising power in the world, but this is a very important issue, and, well, it's an issue that can only be resolved through negotiation.
Yes, I hope that answered your question. Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
Good morning. I'm Andrea, a first-year student from the Masters in International Governance and Diplomacy. First of all, thank you so much for the panel. It was really fun. And I would like to go back to geopolitics, because the Russian invasion of Ukraine has shown us that we ought to take into account the geopolitical risk when making business decisions. And then my question is, how do we actually foster the development of the Global South when most of the Global South has some sort of security issues, and we do need, I think, investments from the developed world in order to help that development. And I don't see how it would be rational, like for an investor in the West, for example, to actually invest in a country such as, I'm thinking of Central African Republic, which is basically controlled by Russia as of now. Does not rational decisions in my books. And at the same time, for further development, we need technological sharing, but as we know, that's not an option. As we need, for strategic reason, we need some sort of superiority over China or Russia. And how do we get to that economic convergence between the global North and the global South in this context?
That's a really important question. I mean, this idea that, you know, when you have a situation of political instability and insecurity, it's very difficult to then move forward with development. So what do you see as a solution to that?
Well, look, it is a difficult question. I think ultimately, even though, you know, you think in terms of developed countries, Europe, States, we come from a very strong thing about aid. And that's by why, you know, countries, developed countries have reduced aid and so on. I mean, you can discuss that, but the fact is that development is not a destiny. You can remain in very bad situation if you have bad governance. I mean, you really need to have, enlightened leaders. We go back to that. You need to have good institutions. You need to have a society that structures around certain principles and so on, so you can develop. I mean, it's not a coincidence why, of 150 countries, only 10 countries in the last 30 years have moved from the middle income to a higher income. And there is Korea and the South Asian countries. There's not a single Latin American country, Latin America, we're not talking about Africa or the poorest. Not a single Latin American countries have moved to the higher income level. They're all, they reach, none of them is beyond $20,000 of income per capita per year. So, and then we can talk about Latin America. I won't get into that, but I mean, the thing is, destiny. I mean, even, and I say, in Latin America, I say, well, look, you think things are bad. Look at Peru, look at, other countries and so on. Things can get much worse. And in many countries, it is very bad. And Argentina used to be, the fifth, sixth most developed countries in the 1920s. And look where it is now, unfortunately. It's full of instability. It doesn't find its road ahead. So, this is to say that I think the main responsibilities at the national level, national populations, with the governance systems and the institutional quality that they can have, foreign aid, international cooperation can help. But I would put that, in the driver's seat, it's the national system and democratic systems and governance that it's the main factor.
I guess the question is, will it get worse? Does it need to get worse before it actually gets better?
Well, that's an argument, but I sometimes, you have of countries that go bottom and there is a crisis and everybody realizes, yeah. Then there is literature that says war, why Europe managed to do the European Union and so on. It was not just because of the carbon agreement. It was to avoid, it was to, if you look at the founders of the European Union, it was to keep the peace, and the idea with that if Europe was cooperating on economics and had strong, then you will be peaceful. And generally that is true, even though you have a war now, but it's not exactly, it doesn't damage this, this argument.
Right. Thank you for that question. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for this very insightful discussion. I am Andrea, I'm a master's student in international governance and diplomacy, and I wanted to come back on the effect and the consequences of robotization and that you touched upon one of your answers. And so, what are your points of view on one of the ideas that has been supported by some business leaders about a global, a universal minimum income? What are your points of view? Is it feasible? Is it feasible in the long run? And above all, will it foster global inequalities? Because I think that many areas of the world, like I think about Europe, for example, with social welfare system, may be more able to do that if compared to other poorer regions of the world.
Other countries that wouldn't be able to afford it necessarily, right? Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is a huge issue, right? Because if we're living in a world where, we are seeing a greater inequality divide, the middle class being hollowed out in many, many countries, in so-called, lower income countries not necessarily making the gains that are necessary to bring up living standards, as you pointed out. Is this a good idea? Can it, and would it create inequalities? The minimum income.
Yeah, I think it's a very powerful idea, and in a way it's a natural evolution of the welfare state philosophy that, that the state, the welfare state should give a hand to everybody, and if people are falling off the safety nets and so on, yeah, of course, Then one is what you said, it is expensive. I mean, not all countries, even developed countries, and if you talk about developing countries that have so many needs, that still have so many people, that get poor, they don't get a pension, they are very truncated, very unfinished welfare states. Even in many developing countries, there is not a welfare state at all, just little bits and pieces. So they are still a long way. And then in terms of the proposition, a minimum, it depends on the, the estimate, but there's 2, 3%, 4%, or even more of GDP devoted to that is not easy. The other is what kind of world? I mean, at first face value, you think, well, yeah, it would be great. At least people will not die of hunger. But ultimately, if you think, you get a bit philosophical about human nature, you need useful things to do. I mean, you need work. I mean, I worked for 14 years in the ILO, and then you have all this concept of decent work and the dignity of work, and work as not just as an income issue, but the fact that this is what you do most of your life. Yeah. And so decent work, work that you like, that is okay. I mean, it's not just work, to earn an income. It's a source of not just self-esteem and dignity for the person, but communities and so on. So I think you have to put this discussion, even though it's important and powerful, side to side. What are the future societies, present and future societies, in terms of opportunities for people to do? You could also think of all sides, sorts of interest in recreation. What do you use your free time? Remember, I finished with this. John Maynard Keynes, a great economist, he wrote an essay that's become very famous, The Economic Future of Our Grandchildren. So he was thinking really ahead. And he was predicting at that time in the 30s that there was going to be such a technological revolution and in productivity that there was going to be technological unemployment. And his question in that essay is, what are the people going to do?
That was incredibly visionary. I mean,
Yes.
It's leading us to this discussion that we have today. Since we just have a few more minutes, let me move to this side of the aisle, if you could ask your question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Anna-Louise Chartier. I'm a first-year student here at PSIA. My question is about Latin America. And as you said before, because I come from Brazil, I always heard that development would come from industry. And as you pointed out very clearly, now we could also point technology, which is very important for development. And my question would be, do you think that Latin America can reach to development through technology and digital revolution? And if yes, how?
What is your brief response to that? Is technology going to save Latin America?
Well, I think there are tremendous possibilities of digital transformation and technological transformation. I mean, there are all sorts of examples. Brazil and other Latin American countries are doing a lot in terms of connectivity, has increased, almost 100% of the population now has a cellular phone. And, this can transform medicine, it can transform education and so on. In reality, and many countries have digital agendas and digital transformation agendas and so on. So, I mean, there's no doubt that there, even in agriculture, you have precision agriculture with drones and, I mean, all over the place. This is transforming our lives, the way we live, educate, work, everything. And there are many initiatives in Latin American countries. I would say all countries, if not all of them, have different ways and plans for digital transformation. But it costs money. The investment requirements are high, so there's a lot of financing to do. You need to organize yourself, good institutions, and the governments have to give high priority to this, otherwise it goes very, very slowly. Still, there are a lot of schools that are not well connected. One of the things that the crisis made clear is that, you have private and, good schools and so on who manage to continue with education by virtual means, but the great majority was a tremendous education out because it couldn't be continued by virtual. So, the new sources of inequality, you used to think of inequality before, as do you know how to read or write or not? You were alphabetic, or how do you say in English, analphabeta, not. So, but now the new alphabetization is digital. Either you interact with these things and know how to do apps and screens and digital, or you are really, that's a big division in terms of job opportunities.
So there's a lot of potential there. Katerina, you had a very quick point to make about that?
Exactly.
And then we'll have time for 2 more quick questions. Yeah.
Yes, because since you specifically addressed Brazil and their potential for growth or prosperity through technology, I'm also very interested in, for example, what financial technology can bring. And there, Brazil is a very good example because they're actually the biggest neo-bank, so the biggest, let's say, new form of digital banks is actually in Brazil. And before it was there was a large majority of the people who did not have access to the financial system, which means that they didn't have a bank account, they didn't have access to specific financial products, which are very important, such as small loans, for example. And with the help of these new digital business models, they can really bring this kind of access to the new product, access to formal economy, and therefore I think especially with Brazil, with large emerging economies, with huge populations, especially there, I think technology is a really huge, or can have a really huge leveraging effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Your question, please.
Hello, sorry.
We hear you.
Fantastic. I'm Marcus. I'm also in economic policy. And my question is, so we touched upon people in Western countries and also Latin America losing their jobs due to manufacturing being moved elsewhere. And we also talked about the fact that it's very hard to reintegrate them into society. And now very specifically and concretely, what policy proposals do you have on a political level at the UN to reintegrate them into society, these people who lost their jobs due to manufacturing outsourcing? And maybe also on a social level, on a political and a social level, what can be done exactly?
Well, they always say that at least the second to last question is the hardest, so that's a great one for you.
Yeah. Well, I think European countries actually have been pretty good in dealing with that, To those of you who are economists, there was this famous economist, Joseph Schumpeter, who talked about creative destruction. And, the healthiest society are the ones that, the modern world, trade, technological revolutions are going to create destruction, but that there are new things. So the big responsibility of public policy is to make sure that the creative part is ahead of the destructive part, so to speak. But there is always going to be some losers, some people that lose, because they have there are obsolete industries or there are obsolete abilities and competencies. So that's why the Europeans have invented, in fact, we've been promoting in Latin America and other countries the concept of active labor market policies, which is a package of social protection, unemployment benefit and so on, so you can, in the transition, at least get some kind of income, training and retraining, skilling and reskilling. This is all life now because of, it's a new paradigm, so every time you have to. And then help and labor market intermediation kind of things to help you connect with new jobs, etc. So I think, that is ideal. Countries that it's expensive, but to the extent that you can finance this, and for instance, the northern countries in Europe, Finland, Norway, and so on, are the ones that have this more flexible system. And actually, if you look at surveys, these are the countries where the concerns about globalization were the least, because they could adapt to globalization and really get into this kind of active labor market system and get new jobs, relatively quickly. So that's the ideal, but it's expensive to finance, but that's the direction in which countries should go.
Thank you very much for that question. Last question, please.
Hello, thank you once again so much for the conversation. I wanted to go back on this provocative idea that you mentioned that friendshoring is not part of deglobalization, but rather of a restructuring of trade. So I wanted to ask whether, and if yes, how it will affect the global and geopolitical order. And finally, going to what Katerina mentioned as the main topic, how can we avoid this friendshoring, which in my personal opinion is part of deglobalization?
Why don't you go first?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to exaggerate my argument. What I'm saying is friendshoring, it does lead to regionalization. It does lead to, a big restructuring, and it is happening now. It does lead to new opportunities for African and some Latin American countries and so on. But it depends how it is done. It depends, I would say there are two dimensions. One is what multinational companies do, or the private sector. And I think many business schools and so on are now teaching how to de-risk or reduce the risk of the, supply chains that, and you manage that and then you diversify, the same as the portfolio theory for finance. Don't put all your shares in the same, so don't put all your outsourcing in the same country. I mean, you have everything in China, of course, you are in the hands of the Chinese, but the same with anywhere else. So distribute and so on. That's the kind of fragmentation, if you want to call that fragmentation, that I see is relatively mild and not so damaging. The one that is more dangerous is if governments want to intervene and get into the game, and they put heavy-handed subsidies to persuade companies to come here or there, then you can have race, race to the bottom, if you like, or certainly race to the top of the fiscal, budgets, because you need, subsidies are very expensive, and you get into a subsidy war, and then there are many countries in the world. This is a game that can only be played by a few rich countries. Many developing countries and so on cannot play that game. So that would create tensions between North and South,
Right. We know you're not
cetera,
mentioning
cetera.
names, but we know who you're talking about, the United States. Katerina, let me give you the last word on this.
Thank you. I think I briefly touched upon my potential solutions or ideas for solutions already before, especially with the redefinition or the new definition of the role of China in our institutional system, fighting socioeconomic divides, which are really, for me, the two essential points, as well as strengthening South-South trade. But in addition, I also really believe that, for example, strengthening South-South trade will only be enabled if regions like Latin America manage to diversify their exports. Because this huge reliance still on raw materials, for example, or even we also see other examples in African countries where countries manage to repay their debt, but only with the income from natural resources. I think this is a really dangerous pattern. So really just the diversification of trade flows. I think this is also going to be essential. And one last point to make, it was briefly touched upon, but not that much. We do live in an information society, which means that information are everything. So here, the fight against misinformation and the fight against polarization through information, strategic political information management. I think this is really a core goal that needs to be there. And for example, for this, we need to start strengthening digital capabilities from a very early age on. So digitalization and education in this regard really need to go hand in hand.
Great. Well, I want to thank the both of you for speaking with us this morning, and also all of you for your questions. Clearly, fragmentation is creating, the biggest one of the biggest challenges that the world is facing. Geostrategic, obviously economic, social, political, and it'll be up to you all as you move forward to really think about ways to sort of, address the major challenges that have come up. So I want to thank you all for being here this morning, and we look forward to hearing from our next panel.
Okay, good morning. Good morning. Just to clarify, now we go into our two parallel panels. If you're interested in the panel on minimizing the use of nuclear weapons, you're already in the right place. It's going to take place here. If you're interested in the panel on how to protect the oceans, that's in the amphitheater just above this one, Chapsal, up on it's the 5th or the 6th floor of this building. And just one little point to notice, you all have a copy of the New York Times. If you turn to page 5, you'll see, of course, our Youth and Leaders Summit advertised in it, which is one of the reasons why it's there, as well as, of course, the outstanding writing that's there. So enjoy your day.
Me too.
Wax jetzt, oder? Nein, warte.
I'm good. Good to see you. Okay, what? Actually do, because I never heard about this, but I think the most
So, c'est à vous.
Thank you. Everybody, we're starting. Can you please sit down? We're starting the panel. Dear speakers, dear audience, dear fellow students. My name is Clément Masselin. I am a first-year master's student in international governance and diplomacy, and I have the great honor of introducing the first panel of the 2023 Youth and Leaders Summit on how to minimize or how to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. 78 years ago, in 1945, humanity opened the Pandora's box of nuclear weapons, changing the world forever. The destructive capacity of this new weaponry was unlike anything seen before, and since then, there have been critical elements of international relations. But as we all know, once opened, the Pandora's box can never be closed again. And so it seems to be with nuclear weapons. They are the deadly inheritance that our generation and the generations after us will inevitably have to deal with. However, what essentially matters are the threats they are associated with, the threat they constitute for our security and our survival. And in 2023, asking how to prevent the use of nuclear weapons is not trivial, because the threats are numerous. Because the complex world we live in is changing fast, and because the nuclear taboo is slowly eroding, such that we now lightly talk about the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Because some countries, such as China and North Korea, are building up their nuclear arsenals, while discussing nuclear arms control is hardly on the table now. And yet, there is hope. Many international organizations, many NGOs, many activists are actively seeking solutions. Some countries even, like Austria, are pushing the matter on the international agenda. Overall, one thing is certain. The way we treat nuclear threats today, in our times of international tensions, will have a decisive impact on the decades to come. And so, to debate on these vital issues today, I have the great honor of introducing the honorable speakers of this panel. Mr. Alexander Schallenberg is the current Foreign Minister of the Republic of Austria, which signed and ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Mr. Schallenberg has been holding this position since June 2019, with the exception of a 2-month period between October and December 2021, during which he served as Chancellor of the Republic of Austria. During his long diplomatic career, he occupied many high positions within the Austrian Foreign Ministry. Our second guest speaker is the retired general from the French Army and strategy expert, Vincent Desportes. He gives conferences around the world on the themes of strategy, leadership, or geopolitics, but he's also a university professor at PSIA and the chairman of the consulting firm Stratford Conseil. Veronika Kvietkova is a first-year master's student in international security, coming from Slovakia. She has been active politically since 2015 and the refugee crisis. She organized political protests, founded and participated to many youth initiatives, and since 2019, she has been an active member of the pro-European political party, Progressive Slovakia. At Sciences Po, she notably founded the Central and Eastern European Students Association. Our last speaker, joining us online today, is Tarja Kronberg. She's an executive board member of the European Leadership Network, a network working to provide solutions to political and security challenges in Europe. She has a long career in peace, security, and disarmament issues, and she has been a member of the European Parliament, a member of the Finnish Parliament, and the Minister of Labour in Finland. Finally, to moderate this exciting panel, I have the great privilege of introducing Mr. Stephen Erlanger, who is the Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. His impressive journalistic career led him to be the New York Times correspondent in 12 world capitals and to be part of 2 teams which were awarded Pulitzer Prizes in 2002 and 2017. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Merci Clément. Merci bien. First of all, let me say it's a tremendous pleasure to be here, to be back in Paris and have such a full room. I'm always amused when you're told you're the future, because you're the future whether you like it or not, I'm afraid. Sometimes I feel we're lucky to be the present still. I was the Woodstock generation, in fact went there, and we were the future once too. But you'll have to judge how we've done with it. We have in front of us an extraordinarily difficult topic. It may not be the key topic in a funny way, because with a real war raging in Europe, I think your generation is having a real prise de conscience. I mean, this is the end of les Trente Glorieuses, of peace and prosperity, when people worried the biggest threats to them were mixing brown glass and green glass. And the world has decided differently. So the stakes are very high. The nuclear stakes are high. There was a wonderful novel I really liked, which talked about the disintegration of the old order between the First and Second World Wars by Hermann Broch, called The Sleepwalkers. I'm sure Alexander knows it. Chris Clark used the same title for his extraordinary history of World War I. And I sometimes wonder whether we're sleepwalking too, particularly on the nuclear question. Arms control is basically stopped. The Chinese aren't very interested. The only thing left is New START, which has had an extension, but may never be extended again. The ABM treaty is gone, the INF treaty is gone. The Conventional Forces in Europe treaty is obviously gone. So we are in a difficult world. I don't want to underestimate it, but we have a panel of very smart people, and I hope Tarja's online with us to talk about these issues. First, I'm going to start with Alexander, if I may. I remember talking to you when Mr. Kurz was Prime Minister a long time ago, a period forby. The title of this whole thing is "The World is at a Crossroads, Existential Risks to the World Order." So my question for you first really is whether the current world order will survive, or is it already dead?
Well, first of all, let me thank you. Thank you, Dean, my dear friend Rancho Gonzalez, and all of you and the young and youth leaders of Sciences Po for inviting me. It's rare that a Monday morning starts as nicely as with this view of young, eager people. Normally my Monday mornings are less eager, less young. So I'm happy to be here. Although the topic is a difficult one. There's this Chinese curse, may you be living in interesting times. And yes, we all are living in interesting times. And sometimes I have the comparison, it's like an earthquake. We're living through an earthquake. The floor is still moving, and we don't know quite when tectonic plates will stop, what the world would look like. I said publicly last year, and I was criticized for that in Austria, when I said 30 years of holiday from history are over. We had something between the fall of the Iron Curtain and, you could say, 2014, Crimea, but at least the 24th of February, which was like a geopolitical ice bucket thrown in our face, brutally tearing us from our daydreams of a post-national, post-historic Europe. And I like to cite a colleague of yours, actually, Robert Kagan, who is an American political scientist who wrote about 19 years ago, the Europeans are living in a post-historic paradise of peace, while outside the rules of power still apply. Well, on the 24th of February, we were kicked out of paradise. And nobody likes that. And it's obvious that people in France and Germany and Austria and elsewhere would like to go back to the status quo ante, back to what they consider the safe world. We didn't actually at the time. That's not possible. There's no returning to the status quo ante. Something has broken, and it has broken for good. You know, ask me whether the architecture, security architecture is dead. I would say no. And I believe one of the biggest tasks we have for this coming year, 23, but for the years to come, is, I would say, three things. Keep our unity. If it's united, we have lost in advance. And we all know that what our actions now will define the standing of the free world, of the Western world for the decades to come. Secondly, and that's very important, keep a sense of proportions. Sans de mesure. Not overshoot. No visa ban for 144 million Russians. You have to acknowledge that Russia won't move. Geography doesn't change. And history does change. Russia will remain part of European history and culture. And we will have to keep up, and there I come to your question, to keep up those platforms, those lines of dialogue, which we have established for good reason in the last couple of decades. And I'm especially thinking about the OSCE, which is seated in Vienna. And we now have debates going on. We had the meeting of ministers in Lodz in Poland, when was it, in December? Last December, and Sergei Lavrov was not invited by the Polish chairman. And I was the only minister saying publicly, I don't think this is a very smart action. Because the OSCE is, together with the United Nations, the only remaining platform where the Russians have to sit, where they're listening to us, where they have to listen to us, but where we can hear them too when time comes. And we have to think about the day after. And there will be a day after. And yes, don't get me wrong, we are fully supporting Ukraine in its struggle for territorial integrity and sovereignty. And the brutal war of aggression launched by Russia, this neo-imperialistic madness, has to stop. So no doubt about that. But there will be a day after. And we need a security architecture. And this security architecture, from my perspective, will have to include one another the biggest geographical neighbor, which is a nuclear power, a P5, and it's called Russia.
Good. No, this is one of the great European debates right now, obviously. I mean, when you worry, people talk about north-south. The big problem in the EU is east-west, inside NATO also, between what Donald Rumsfeld used to call old Europe, of which you are a representative despite your youth, and so-called New Europe, which was occupied by the Soviet Union, and which wants Russia defeated in a fundamental way. So this won't happen again. I mean, the way people talk about it is security with Russia, even post-Putin, or security against Russia, which is the way Central Europeans tend to think about it. So it's a big debate, and it brings me to General Deportes, who's a military strategist. And as we think about this war that's ongoing, how seriously do you take the risk of nuclear exchange, first with tactical nuclear weapons? I mean, is it Russian propaganda designed to intimidate? Is it real? What's your judgment, sir?
Thank you for your question. Thank you everybody for being here. The subject we are tackling with this morning is very, very, very important. And you are a young student, and you have to build the new world we are going to live in, and you are going to think and to design it. The old world, my feeling, is dead. And I fully agree with all you have said about the crisis of the day and about the real question we have to tackle with now. To answer the question, as far as the nuclear weapons are concerned, we are back to the Middle Age. We are back to the age, We are now at a pre-1962 situation. So all we have built since 1962 is almost dead, with almost, as you said, no disarmament agreement between countries. So everything may happen every day, and I think from the beginning, this war is waged under nuclear threat. At the same time, if the deterrent system would have not exist, I think that now, with the French, the US, the British, the German, would be at war with their weapons against Russia. And I think that every main town in America, San Francisco, or Paris, or Berlin, or Vienna, would have been under attack now from Russia. So we see that there is advantage and disadvantages of this system. But to answer clearly your question, we don't know what is going to happen, but we need to be sure that it may happen, because one of the actors may strike every second and use its nuclear forces every second. And we have to ask ourselves, what a rapid dog can do when he's in a dead hand, you know. At the end, he may very well use all his weapons to get something and not to die as yet. So we have never to forget that this is a possibility. So we need to be very firm, but to be responsible, because this may happen. And the point now, as you said, is to keep dialogue open. It's very, very important, obviously. And not only to keep the dialogue open, but to try to re-establish way of dialogue, official or non-official. But obviously, we are in a very particular situation. I think that the situation is more like World War I than World War II, because we are not going to fight within Moscow. Nobody will go there, because we are under the nuclear umbrella. You know, we are more like during World War I, because we don't plan to go over there. We can't cross the border as we didn't in 1918. And we have to understand that the First War was a terrible war, but we have to ask ourselves how it ended. Two things. There was first, to make peace, you need a positive and a negative incentive. The negative incentive for the German was the real push of the alliance, you know, with